I've heard a lot about how toxic the Arch Linux community is, and I've even been accused myself of being a toxic Arch Linux elitist. And if you spend any time around the web, you can definitely see some snarky answers being directed to newbies by Arch veterans. And you might even have been told to RTFM or read the friendly manual after asking a question that has a simple answer online. Basically, instead of just telling them the answer, they tell them to go do their own research. And there's this general sentiment online that Arch Linux users are so elitist and condescending, and that they think they're so much smarter than Ubuntu users. So why can't Arch Linux users just be chill and be nice to people? Are they really as toxic as people say? Let's find out in this video. Now let's take a look at the Arch Linux user in the wild. Here's a common site on the Arch Linux forum. An innocent newbie is asking a question. This might not be the brightest question because the solution can easily be found with a web search, but this time let's just give him a break. Oh no, someone has very rudely told him to read the manual and fix the problem himself. Look at that, he just dropped a link to the Arch Linux wiki and left. Why couldn't he have been nicer? But first off, we have to talk about Arch Linux and what it is. So Arch Linux is notoriously a distribution for more technical users. After all, there is the infamous Arch Linux installation to deter newbies. But for all its reputation, I wouldn't really say that Arch Linux is a distribution just for the elite. I think that newbies can use Arch Linux, but the issue is, if you want to use Arch Linux, you have to know that it is a do-it-yourself distro. So on Arch Linux, you are expected to do almost everything yourself. After all, the installation is very minimal. Whenever you install Arch Linux, you'll basically get a terminal and that's it. The only thing you'll see after you install it is just a TTY. And the design philosophy behind Arch Linux is to give the user the most control possible. So the philosophy is not to be user-friendly. There's lots of other distributions that are user-friendly, and that's great. But Arch is about being user-centric. So what does that mean? It means that you have the control to do everything that you want on your system. It's not like you're on Windows or something and something breaks and it's just a black box that you have no idea how to fix. You can go into the system files and fix everything yourself, and you are expected to. And of course, Arch Linux is not for everyone. So on the Arch Linux wiki, they make it pretty clear that it is only for those who have the ability and the time and the desire for a do-it-yourself Linux distribution. And a lot of people don't want that from Linux, and it's totally fine. A lot of people just want to click through an installer. They don't want to spend the entire weekend tinkering on your computer in order to make it look a little bit nicer. Some people do, like me, and that's also totally fine. If that is you, then Arch Linux is probably for you. But because of Arch Linux's philosophy, you're kind of expected to have a basic understanding of what you're doing on Arch Linux. And let's not forget that Arch Linux has one of the most extensive resources in all of Linux, the Arch Wiki. Yes, the fabled wiki where you can find answers to almost everything, because just about any question that you have about Arch Linux can be answered from taking a few minutes and reading the wiki. And resources for finding out about things are all over the place, not just the wiki. If you want to learn how to use a tiling window manager, you read through the documentation. You can run man in your terminal. You can search up old forum posts. And to be honest, 99% of the questions that I have when using my computer can be solved like this. And thousands of hours have gone into the Arch Wiki and all of these resources, so use them. And if you ask a question online, maybe let's say for example on the Arch Linux subreddit or the Arch Linux forums, you do have to keep in mind that people here are volunteering their time for free, so be respectful of their time. And when somebody does ask a stupid question, because like it or not, some questions are kind of stupid, like somebody asking a question on the forum when all they could do is paste that question into a web search and immediately get the answer, then you can understand why somebody might be a little bit frustrated to find a question that can be answered easily with just a few minutes of research. Overall, Arch Linux is really not that hard. I've done videos in the past explaining how it's really not as bad as a lot of people imagine. And no, on Arch Linux, things aren't constantly breaking all the time. You aren't having to constantly fix things. And Arch Linux isn't that hard. It just requires patience, reading, and a lot of manual configuration. Now, it's probably too complicated for someone who just wants a drop-in operating system on their computer. But if you don't mind learning new things and tinkering around with your system, then you'll probably really enjoy using Arch Linux. Now, if that doesn't sound appealing to you at all, if the thought of spending a few hours trying to fix Grub because you broke it sounds completely unappealing, then Arch Linux probably isn't for you, and that's fine. Some people get really offended when people tell them you probably shouldn't be using Arch because they think maybe they're saying they're too stupid for Arch, but I wouldn't really say you're too stupid for Arch. It just means that you don't want to spend all day tinkering with your system. Like I've said in the past, there's plenty of other great distributions besides Arch that would probably fit your needs better if that's not you. Now, of course, you're not elite just because you managed to install Arch Linux. It doesn't make you an expert. And in fact, it's getting even more accessible these days with things like the Arch install script. But using Arch Linux for a long period of time kind of gets you more into the do-it-yourself mindset that you need to enjoy Arch Linux. Things will break, you're going to have to go into system files and fix them. And if you never read the wiki or the documentation or the man pages and try to figure things out yourself, if you just rely on everyone else to answer questions for you, then you probably won't get very far in Arch Linux. I think that using Arch Linux does make you more independent in a way, and so people using Arch Linux will expect you to do the same. Now, of course, if you do want to ask a question, if you just can't figure something out on Arch Linux, it happens every once in a while, but you want to ask smart questions. If you do, then you're not going to get the negativity from posting a question that wastes people's time. Because there are some questions out there that definitely waste people's time and can annoy them. Like if you ask, why isn't my Arch Linux booting without providing any other information, then nobody's really going to be able to help you. And people don't want to go back and forth with you asking for your system specs, the version of Linux you're using, the error messages you're receiving. So if you do want your question answered, just provide as much information as you can up front, what you've already done to try to fix the problem, and just try to make it as easy as possible for someone to answer your question. And if you just ask better questions, then you're going to get a lot less dismissive replies and more actually helpful advice. So that's one spectrum of the toxic Arch Linux users. Another thing a lot of people complain about is how superior Arch Linux users think they are. But you do have to remember that a lot of what you see about Arch Linux online is ironic, including in my videos. In my videos, whenever I say, I use Arch by the way, it's not me dunking on Ubuntu users, it's literally just a meme. I know I'm not supposed to explain the joke because it makes it less funny, but that's what it is most of the time. So if you get offended by somebody on 4chan saying that if you don't use Arch Linux, then you're the small brain Wojak and I'm the Chad, well, you probably just got trolled epic style. Because I really don't think that there are that many people that unironically view themselves as so much smarter and so much more superior just overusing some Linux distribution. I think a lot of it is actually people like Ubuntu users that take memes too seriously and get kind of an inferiority complex. And I know that because it was kind of myself. Whenever I used Ubuntu before, I knew that it wasn't the cool distro. I knew it was like the newbies distribution, and I kind of felt dumb just because I didn't use a more advanced distro. But of course, nothing is wrong with using Ubuntu or GNOME or Nano instead of Vim or anything else. It's more of people just poking fun at you. But sometimes the memes are there just because the person who made it thinks that it's better. Like for example, I shill Arch Linux a lot just because I think it's the best tool for the job. At least in my case, I really was not happy using Linux until I found Arch. For me at least, the experience using Ubuntu was pretty bad. Like, after using Vim for years, I kind of want to poke fun at myself in the past for using Nano, when learning Vim was such a game changer for me. So I know that we're on the internet, and you can't really convey sarcasm that well on the internet, but a lot of it is just that. And sure, I'm sure that there are some people out there that the only thing going on in their life is that they're proficient at using Linux, and so they lord over the fact that they're better than a Linux noob, but I really don't think it's the vast majority of people. Like I said, I use it because for me, it's the best tool for the job. Not for some weird superiority and eliteness thing. I have better things to do in my life than feeling superior than some random internet users. And if you're like me before, when I had this weird kind of feeling of inferiority because I used Ubuntu and all of these basic normie tools, then increase your knowledge and try some new things, try some new tools. Like before, I didn't understand all of the Vim memes about how Vim is so much better than every other text editor, and then I actually tried it and I liked it. Of course, in life you can never go wrong learning something new, so learn some more Linux skills. Learn how to navigate the command line. Maybe learn how to do something weird like use a terminal file manager, and maybe you'll find, like me, that is actually better than using a graphical file manager. With all that being said, of course, there are just some people that are just being plain rude on the internet. It's not very nice, but that's just the nature of the beast. That's life on the internet. And hey, compared to Twitter, Arch Linux users are the nicest people that you'll ever meet online. But I think the vast majority of Arch users are not super toxic. And if you don't believe me, go on the Arch Linux forums or the Arch Linux subreddit and try to find a toxic comment. Look, I tried to find one for this video and it was actually really difficult. The vast majority of people are totally normal, if not a bit terse. Like, they're not dropping pleasantries every sentence, but in my opinion, that's not really toxic. And if somebody tells you to read an Arch wiki page, that's just their way of helping you. And if you go through and spend a few minutes reading the wiki, then you'll probably find the solution to your problem. And obviously, there are a few vocal people who will probably insult you, but it's definitely not the majority. And of course, if you are an Arch Linux user and you see a beginner in the wild, I always recommend you to be kind and polite to them. I always try my best to be polite to everyone. I've had my fair share of beginner questions on my videos. Sometimes, let's face it, they're stupid questions because if they had watched the entire video, then they would already know the answer. But I still do my best and try to respond to them politely. You can say, read this Arch wiki page without being rude about it. And sometimes they don't even know it's a stupid question. Maybe English is their second language, and it's difficult to understand some things. You don't always know what somebody's going through, so just be polite. And if you want to make the internet culture better, then be the change that you want to see. Pay it forward, and once you build up your knowledge, share it with others. Answer forum posts, be helpful, and do it respectfully and politely. And so that's why I think that the claims of Arch Linux community being super toxic is a little bit exaggerated. But of course, feel free to share your opinion in the comments. If you think I'm completely off base, then we can have a nice, polite conversation. And I promise you, I won't tell you to read the friendly manual.